Yeah, I'm John Holloway, as Mike said. I live in Puebla in Mexico. I've been there for, 25 years now, and teach there at the university in the postgraduate school of sociology. Partly I'm here just for the pleasure of being here. Partly I'm here as well because I had heard something about just how interesting the work you're doing here in Lincoln is. And I wanted to see if there was some way in which we could collaborate with the work here. So this is one of the things we've been talking about this morning, and one of the things that I'm keen to develop. So I really see this talk, I suppose, a little bit in that context. When Mike invited me to come and talk, I said yes, that I'd love to, and that I wanted to talk about capital. And I think three reasons. I mean, the most obvious reason is just that I've just finished giving my course on capital, which I give every 2 years in the context of our master's degree in Puebla. And I suppose I get very obsessed by it in the course, and it was the obvious thing to say I would think about. But I suppose it's a little bit more than that, because I think this year, well, it's the 150 years since the publication of Capital. But it was also, I think, that I realized that I've actually been giving courses on capital probably for more than 40 years. And I was aware of that in that process, we were developing a kind of a non-orthodox interpretation of capital. And this year I wanted to try and work that out more carefully, so that in fact there will be a book coming out based on the course. It'll be coming out in Spanish. We'll see about the possibility of translating it afterwards. And part of that process was writing down my thoughts on capital in the form of 14 theses, which I just finished a couple of weeks ago. Since the course is in Spanish, I wrote them in Spanish. But here, what I decided to do today was to take those 14 points as a basis for talking and a basis for discussion. I don't imagine we'll get to the end of the 14, and really for me that doesn't matter. But we'll get into them anyway. The second reason for wanting to talk about capital is that I suppose more and more I'm convinced, or more and more the principle, I think, of what we do in Puebla, and perhaps I think also of what you're doing here, is the idea that now we're in a situation where there is really only one scientific question left. That we who work in the universities, I mean, in a sense, we dedicate ourselves or our lives to scientific activity, and I think more and more we have to think, yeah, really now in this situation, there's only one question left for scientific reflection. And that question is, how on earth do we get out of the mess we're in? How on earth do we stop the headlong race towards the self-annihilation of humanity? I mean, it's now, I think, in a way in which it wasn't so clear 30, 40, 50 years ago, it's very clear that we're in that rush towards self-annihilation with a high degree of probability. I'm not saying it's certain, but it's really fairly clear that as long as we maintain the present social system, then it is quite likely that we will just destroy ourselves completely in the near to medium future. I mean, either through nuclear war or through the destruction of the natural conditions for human existence. And if we think of science not just as a process of carefully documenting our own suicide, but as an activity that should be related to the future of humanity, then I think we can actually simplify things and say, well, there's really only one question left, and that is, how do we get out of this appalling mess that we're in? And I think it's partly a question for the natural sciences. I mean, because there are technical questions of what on earth do we do about global warming. But it also has to be the central question for the social sciences. If we think that all that is happening in terms of the destruction of natural conditions of existence really arises from a society where the principal determinant of social action is the pursuit of profit or the expansion of value, then the question is, how on earth do we break that logic? How do we break that logic of development? Or how do we come back to the question of revolution, whether or not we want to use the word revolution? No? And there's a principle for organizing our academic activity, if we're in the universities, or just our thinking if we're outside, then I think that's probably a simple and important guideline. Is just how on earth do we get out of this disaster? And there it is clear that Capital, the book Capital, is an important part of that discussion. Marx is saying very clearly in Capital, I mean, really in the first sentences of Capital, the problem, this whole dynamic of death is based on the fact that our wealth takes the form of the commodity. From that follows absolute disaster. The third reason why I think it's important to read Capital is, I think, for me to connect with the tradition. I mean, I think with all the emphasis on rethinking Marxism and rethinking revolution, it's important at the same time to pay homage to people who have struggled and dedicated their lives over the last 150 years to getting rid of capitalism and creating a radically different form of society. You know, I suppose in living in Mexico, I'm very conscious of that, having two close friends and colleagues, both Guatemalans, whose parents, members of the Communist Party, were assassinated by the state. Then I think, yes, I mean, you cannot just say, we have nothing to do with that sort of politics. You have to say, well, here is a long, deep tradition of people dedicating their lives in ways that we perhaps cannot even imagine, no? To trying to get rid of a system of exploitation, of destruction, and create a different sort of world. And part of that tradition, of course, was reading Capital. But I also think that the best way of honoring their memory is to say, yes, we respect you enormously, but you were wrong. You were wrong. We know now that the way you were thinking about revolution led to the failure of revolution. We know now that we don't want to go that way. We know now that Moscow in the 1950s, for example, is not for us a great pole of attraction. We don't sit around thinking, oh my goodness, if only we'd lived in Moscow in the 1950s. No, that is not the way we want to think about revolution. That is not the way we want to think about changing the world. So part of honoring their struggles is to say, yes, we respect enormously what you tried to do, but we think now that it didn't work. No, it didn't work, and it didn't work. The fact that it didn't work had to do with the particular historical circumstances of the different places, but it also had to do with the general conception of revolution and how to bring about revolution through conquering the state. And part of that tradition was the way in which capital was understood, because capital was always a central text. So if we go back to reading Capital now, it seems to me we have to go back critically. We have to say, yes, I mean, this continues to be a central text, but we cannot, I think, understand it in the same way as people understood it 40, 50, 100 years ago. No? I mean, our changing concept of revolution must in some way affect the way we read these texts. And I think for me, the main, and to some extent, perhaps we need to do that against Marx at times. I mean, I don't mean against Marx in the obvious sense of saying, well, he got this point wrong. At times we have to say, well, no, we don't quite agree with the way that Marx was thinking about these problems. No. I think for me, the main general criticism I would have of the traditional reading of Capital is that it was understood as an analysis of the system of domination. It's understood as this is how capitalism works. Okay? If we look at how capitalism works, we can see that it is disastrous. But that problem with that traditional reading from a concept of domination is that it doesn't leave any room for us. We are merely the objects of capitalist development. And if we're the objects of capitalist development, then how on earth can we become the subjects of revolution? How can we become the subjects of social transformation? So I suppose what I want to do is read Capital not as an analysis of domination, but really as an analysis of social antagonism or social struggle in which we are at the center, no? And not just as objects. But I suppose that, in a way, is my critique of a lot of left-wing thought in general, is that it just focuses on domination and actually reproduces a way of thinking in which we appear simply as objects, as the victims of the capitalist system. And okay, we are the victims of the capitalist system, but we are more than that. We are also the subjects. No? And if we are not the subjects, then we are actually, against our will, we are actually reproducing a closure in the world. I mean, the problem of a lot of left-wing thought is that it closes down the possibilities, whereas really the question is, how on earth in this situation where everything seems to be so closed, where everything just seems to be so heavy and grind us down, how on earth in this situation do we think against that? How do we think and act against that? How do we open up? Not how do we close, how do we open? And I think that opening obviously it's a question of hope and optimism, and very much developed in the sort of work that Anna is doing. No? But it's also a question of opening the categories of thought, opening the categories of thought that seem to close, and saying, no, inside these categories, there is actually a struggle going on. And that takes us, that's kind of the introduction. That would take me on to the first point. I don't know if you want to interrupt me or if I just carry on regardless. Okay, perhaps I'll take the first 3 points which come together and then interrupt. I mean, interrupt me at any point. That's fine. And when you read Capital, what I feel strongly is that we have to start at the very beginning. We actually have to start with the first sentence of Capital, which seems obvious, except that virtually nobody does it. And all the commentaries on Capital, hardly anyone mentions the first sentence. They all start from the second sentence. And for me, that has a tremendous theoretical and political impact. We have here, there are 2 pages. One is the 14 points. The other are a number of quotations from Capital that I just wanted to refer to. That's this page. And the top quotation, okay, is actually the first sentence of Capital, where Marx says, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Okay? Second quotation is just a different translation, and the third quotation is just the original in German. Okay, but we'll take that. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Or we can say, in short, the wealth of those of this society presents itself or exists in the form of the commodity. Okay? And then Marx, this is really what causes the problem, is that Marx goes on in the second sentence, which is quoted near the bottom of the page, okay? The one-line quotation. He then goes on to say, our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. And you think, fine. And everybody says, fine, we will start with the commodity. And there are lots of discussions about why does Marx start with the commodity? Why doesn't he start with money? Why doesn't he start with labor? And the truth is that Marx is wrong. He does not start with the commodity. That comes in the second sentence. And it's kind of inviting people to forget what is in the first sentence. And the first sentence says, no, he doesn't start with the commodity, he actually starts with wealth. No, he starts the wealth of those societies, of this society, exists in the form of the commodity. He doesn't start with the commodity, that comes at the end of the sentence. Wealth starts, is the first point. And you think, well, yeah, so what? No, it's all kind of economic anyway, isn't it? And then, when you're reading the Grundriss and you come to page 488, you find this magnificent quotation where he explains what he means by wealth. You know, he says here in the first sentence of Capital, wealth exists in the form of the commodity. Okay, fine. That also exists. But, you know, it suggests that you have a concept of wealth that might not exist in the form of the commodity, or perhaps in other societies did not or will not exist in the form of the commodity. So the question is, okay, what does wealth mean if it doesn't exist in the form of the commodity? And his answer is beautiful. This is Marx at his, wow, best, no, for me. In fact, however, when the limited bourgeois form is stripped away, what is wealth? Okay, so that's the question that the first sentence suggests. Other than the universality of human needs, capacities, pleasures, productive forces, etc., created through universal exchange, which I think he means universal interaction, really. The full development of human mastery over the forces of nature, those of so-called nature as well as humanity's own nature, the absolute working out of his creative potentialities with no presupposition other than the previous historic development which makes this totality of development, that is, the development of all human powers as such, the end in itself, not as measured on a predetermined yardstick, where he does not produce himself in one specificity, but produces his totality, strives not to remain something he has become, but is in the absolute movement of becoming. In bourgeois economics, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete working out of the human content appears as a complete emptying out, this universal objectification as total alienation, and the tearing down of all limited one-sided aims as sacrifice of the human end in itself to an entirely external end. And then you go back and you read that first sentence and you want to scream, you want to cry. Because what Marx is saying is, look, all this, our humanity, our absolute movement to becoming, our possibility of developing ourselves in a completely universal, full-sided way, all this magnificent capacity that we as humans have, this wealth, which would actually be better translated as richness, as it could easily have been translated. No? This richness, this human richness, exists as an immense accumulation of commodities. And you want to scream and you want to cry, and you know that it's true, and you know that every time you go out in the street, and every time you pass a shop, and every time you pass an advertisement, and every time you think of what you're going to do or what the possibilities are in life, you know that it's true, that your human richness is dominated by the commodity form. That is to say, as he develops later on, it's dominated by money. No. And you think, no. And you realize that Marx is starting Capital with a deep pain and a deep anger and a scream. And that's what he devoted his life to. And then you see the normal interpretation of capital that starts from the commodity. And that pain is just jumped over. And that kind of touching our guts in a way is forgotten. No? And here is, he's saying there in the Grundrisse that that's what I mean by wealth. That's what I mean by richness, is our absolute movement to becoming. Our joy in life, the joy of our creativity, our potential. It's kind of Marx, this is the kind of, perhaps the most intense hymn to human creativity that is to be found in, I don't know, it's a fantastic paragraph. And he says, but in economics, there is the critique already of political economy. This absolute joy of human creativity in bourgeois economics, as it says at the end, this complete working out of the human content appears as a complete emptying out. No? This working out of the human content, which is our creative potential, our doing what we want to do in life, exists as a complete emptying out. And of course, very often the experience of employment is exactly that. It is exactly this emptying out of our capacities. It's our reduction to quantities. You know? Like, for example, when he talks that, the richness is the development of all human powers as the end in itself, not as measured in a predetermined on a predetermined yardstick. And all of us who work in the universities, all of us who came, professors, lecturers, students, that's what we wanted to do. At least those of us who are older enough and were naive enough thought, well, yeah, we're going into the universities because we want to develop our human powers as an end in itself. We want to study what we want to study. We want to develop what we think is important to think about. And the university comes with its quantitative, predetermined yardstick. Now, forget about all that nonsense. This is what it's all about. It's about quantities and how you satisfy the quantitative. So you really, and that's why I think that in the first thesis, what I put, we really have to start from the idea that capital is not an analysis of how the system works. Capital is actually this scream of anger. It's this scream of dignity, of saying, we are more than that. No. That is our richness. No? So Marx is really setting up richness or wealth on the one hand against value or the commodity on the other hand. No. And the other thing is that he goes completely against, I suppose, this dreadful tendency on the left to think from poverty. No? Because if you think from poverty or you think from being a victim, really it's the same thing. We think, oh no, there's so much poverty in the world, that's dreadful. No. Poor people, poor people of Africa, poor people of Latin America. poor people in Britain. Okay. And Marx is saying, no, but that's not the starting point. The starting point is richness. The starting point is our potential, which is entrapped, which is encaged. Don't start thinking about poor people, because poor people actually leads you into the logic of domination and holds you entrapped in the system, finally. No, it's not. That's not what it's about. He's saying what it's about is exactly the opposite. Start from our richness, start from what we could do, start from the way that it is being frustrated. No. So it's not, when I say there's a difference between whether we start with wealth in the first sentence or whether we start with a commodity in the second sentence, there is actually a huge difference, because the commodity leads us straight in to the orthodox interpretation of capital. No? The commodity is the basis, the founding stone of the system of domination. If we think of, I say here, what capital, the first one, capital is the cry of richness being encaged. The first version was capital is the cry of a wild beast being encaged. Think of we being the wild beast, we being this uncontrollable creature, finally, that is being controlled and tied down, and we are tied down by the fact that our richness exists in the form of the commodity. And we feel that every single day. We feel that as something that hurts us. Because if richness exists in the form of the commodity, that means richness exists in the form of money, you know. And how can I go and see, I don't know, how can I go and see my daughter who lives in London if I don't have enough money for the airfare, for example? How can I have access to these wonderfully beautiful things that are being produced by workers, creators, producing clothes that I would love to have if I don't have money? How can I just, finishing my studies at the university, how can I just go, why can't I just go and travel around the world and see human richness and how it is in all these countries? Because I don't have money. So we actually feel this conflict all the time, every single day of our lives, between the potential and the existence of that potential in the commodity form. No? So that's, I think you in a way, yes, read capital, but read capital as a working out of rage, as a working out of Marx's rage, and as a working out of our rage. Because if we read capital, as we should, as we must, as I hope we have, as if not then tomorrow, then if we read capital, we're obviously associating ourselves in some way with what Marx is saying. Okay. And if Marx can do that, and if we can do that, then it can only be that because what he says is not true, or is and is not true. Okay, I mean, it is true in the sense that wealth exists or richness exists in the commodity form, But we still have this idea of a richness that might exist outside the commodity form. And if we have this idea, then it is not just because we are very clever. Well, of course it is because we're very clever. But it is also because we have the experience of it. We actually have the experience of a different richness. We have the experience of richness that doesn't exist in the commodity form. Part of our definition, our feeling of friendship, for example, is that if we invite our friends to dinner, we do not normally present them with a bill at the end of the night. No? All the time we are actually, the dinner is a richness, it is a wealth. It is a wealth that doesn't exist in the commodity form. No? Yeah, and this is true of a large part of our life. And the kind of what we think of love or friendship or compañerismo or whatever is actually a rejection of the commodity form. It is actually saying, no, we want to create social relations on a different basis. And it is only because that exists that we can understand Marx when he says that wealth exists in the commodity form. It is only because we have an experience of a wealth that does not exist in the commodity form, an experience and a projection, because we have an idea of what the world might look like if it were not completely dominated by money. Okay. So in a way, what we're doing, I suppose, is opening up the category of the commodity and saying, let's look inside it. And what we do when we look inside it is that we find a conflict. We find an antagonism. We find, on the one hand, yes, it's certainly true that this exists, this money form that shapes everything, this commodity form that oppresses us. But we also find that there's a struggle against this all the time. In other words, this richness, when Marx says richness exists or wealth exists in the commodity form, then necessarily he is writing between the lines and saying, the only reason I can say this is because it is also not true. No? It is also the case that richness exists beyond the commodity form. And if that were not the case, it would make no sense at all. And also I would be incapable of saying richness exists in the commodity form. In other words, by saying that richness exists in the commodity form, he is opening a world to us. He's saying, but that's not all. The very fact that he says that richness or wealth exists in the commodity form is opening the existence or possibility of a world in which wealth does not exist in the commodity form. Okay? Do you want to interrupt me? I mean, I can go on happily talking for hours since I've just been giving you, but I think it'd be healthy to be interrupted.
This phrase, the absolute movement of becoming, if that is key way of describing wealth, where is Marx getting that idea from? Intellectually, what is the heritage that he is?
It's pure Hegel, isn't it? Yeah, I think. I mean, but you can understand, you know, the feeling. No, I mean the feeling. Yes, I mean this is our richness. Is our all our capacity. It's us. it is in a way the divine us, that it's divine humanity. This is all our potential, all our capacities. If it weren't for the commodity form, I could be a ballet dancer or an operatic singer or whatever. I mean, it's this idea. Obviously, that's not true, but it's this kind of idea of the world is open to us. No, that's what he's saying. The world is open to us. That's what richness means. And the commodity comes and it closes it down. And that is what we feel every single day. No, that's what university education is about. That's what school education is about. It's the closing down of, not entirely, but that's partly what it's about.
It's really making me think about how what we commodify. And it just made me think about, we pay people in this country to look after orphans. That it's a good thing though, but isn't it a terrible thing we have to do? Gosh, it's really making me upset.
Good. Good. It's supposed to. You really should cry after reading that sentence. You think, yes. I mean, there's this huge, enormous advance of commodification over the last 20 years that we all feel. It can be commodification of education, whether or not it's formally public. Commodification of healthcare, no, which we all feel. Commodification of care of the elderly, no. Commodification of the view, certainly in Puebla, there are more and more of these huge billboards around the place. You don't see the beautiful volcano that we have just outside anymore because there are so many billboards in the way. So it's the commodification of your view, of your space, of people's life.
And I love relations become so much commodified to large extent.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the commodity, it penetrates everything. That's the point, isn't it? It's, and the love, I suppose, is the struggle against the penetration of the commodity form. Yeah. Sorry, Anna.
I was thinking that the ultimate representation of this contradiction is the commodification of labor, human labor.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
There is when we really feel we live in a society where we have to work in order to live.
Yes.
How do we come out of
That's right. Yes.
It's one step, and then we need the money to live.
Yes.
And then we feel that we're failing.
Yeah.
And then again, and so that contradiction is ongoing. So the crack, the break. How do we do at the same time? Work in order to live. Otherwise, we will not live if we don't have money. You forgot to mention food.
Food?
Yes.
Yes,
money
indeed.
to buy food.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's...
Yeah. But even before he comes on to labor, he's talking about commodification of just our lives, of our wealth. And I mean, I think it's also there, well, it comes in later, but the method is very important, because what he does in the rest of Capital is a process of logical derivation. He takes it kind of step by step, saying, well, if wealth exists as the commodity, then the development of money is inevitable. If we have money, then the development of capital is inevitable. If we have capital, then this is based on exploitation, etc. So really, if we want to think about how do we get out of this dreadful mess, what Marx is saying very clearly is that it's not a question of changing the government. It is a question of emancipating wealth from the commodity form. All left-wing governments actually promote commodification. They have to. That's partly what the state does. And Marx is saying, no, as long as wealth exists in the commodity form, you can forget about a future for humanity. And I think that is actually coming much closer to us now than it was in Marx's time. Marx's time, humans didn't have the capacity to destroy all humanity. Now they have. Now there's, dozens of politicians who can just destroy us all by pressing a button, no? Half of them mad, presumably. But yeah, Marx is saying, no, I mean, this is the issue. I mean, and there it all is in the first sentence. The fact that our richness, our capacity, absolute movement of becoming, our love for each other, all this exists in the commodity form. That is the problem.
This is a wonderful venue for you to be speaking. It's just wonderful. It's raising so many things in one's mind. So thank you. But I'm thinking about this colossal possibility of the transformation of wealth in its commodity form, and what that transformation would look like. And is this what you're sort of alluding to in terms of a different kind of revolution, something that is a transformative process, whether it's people who are transformed, that has some impact on this transformation that you want to see of wealth as the commodity. I mean, it's almost unbearable and inconceivable to think about how that would, what shape that would take, what it would look like.
That's the problem, isn't it? Yeah, the problem is we don't know. I think one conclusion from that would really be that the main problem, perhaps, with the revolutions of the 20th century was that they were far too timid. They didn't actually challenge the commodity form. Which also is connected with reading Capital in a different way, but it's there, Marx is there, it seems to me, it's clear as anything. He's saying, no, the problem is the commodity form. The problem is that our immense human richness exists in that form. How do we break that? We really don't know. I mean, that's why it's so important to think. I mean, that's precisely the challenge. That's precisely why all education should be fixed on this problem. How do we break this logic of death? No. But yes, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which we consciously and unconsciously do break or try to break with the commodity form in our everyday relations. As I was saying, if you invite friends to dinner, you don't charge them. If you, I mean, there are lots of things we do not because of the money we're going to get, but just for the pleasure it gives us, or because we think it's a good thing to do or a useful thing to do. No? And I think we have to kind of start from a recognition of the strength of anti-commodification in our daily lives and move from there. And of course, in lots of cases, it's not just the personal inviting friends to dinner. I mean, there are people, lots of movements, of cooperatives, of autonomous movements, trying to create relations on a different basis. Always contradictory, because they're in a world dominated by money, but there are so many movements of...
I think this is most clearly seen in the world as we present it to our children. We don't teach them investment banking, we teach them compassion. We don't teach them how to avoid tax, we teach them teamwork and love. We see this world of richness in the way that we teach our children. I mean, I can't speak for everyone's childhood, but when I was growing up, there was definitely a sentiment of, if you try hard enough, you can do anything. Anything is possible. And that exists in antagonism to the reality of the world. But I think that's important to see, the way that we present the world to our children is not the way as it is now. I think that personifies how we see the world as it is now as academics and the world then. The way that we paint that shows the world.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Though I suspect that it's contradictory. If you go with a small child to a shop, and a small shop, they usually have sweets and chocolate kind of low down at the level of the children, and if the child grabs for a sweets, you will probably say, oh, but no, we have to pay for those. In other words, we are commodifying there the child's desires, I suppose. You know, we do that as well. We have to live in this world, of course.
And they say, why?
Yes, and they say, you say why, and you say, well, just read Capital and you'll understand.
It's like an interesting point. I think even ourselves were maybe almost desensitized to the amount of commodification that is going on. We're almost not aware that we're sort of falling foul of it more so than we think. Maybe to begin, we just need to elevate our consciousness towards a level of commodification, what's going on. Because we are sometimes doing things which is against this idea, but then we're maybe not so aware of that either. So who knows how we're going to heighten our awareness of this, but I mean, something like materialism, for example, is sort of perpetuated by sort of taking advantage of the limitations of our psychology. So what I mean by that is that we're unconsciously adhering to it. So maybe taking steps to increase our awareness could be the beginning.
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think that, yeah, the first step has to be kind of a process of recognizing the commodification and recognizing our reactions against commodification. You know, it's really both things at the same time. And recognizing, I think that also means recognizing that these categories that we often treat as just things are in fact contain hidden within them intense struggles. No? I mean, money is the most obvious case. If we tend to think of money as a thing. You know, either we have it or we don't have it. Tough, no, well. But it's actually more than that. If you think of, you know, the money, the banknote that you may or may not have in your pocket, is actually a process. I mean, again, if you think of going to the shop with a small child, you are involved in monetizing the relation between this child and the sweets, or between the child and the producers of the sweets. But we also know, if we think a bit more, that this monetization of social relations, of which we are part, also causes the death of what? Hundreds of thousands of people each and every day. I mean, the number of people who die in the world each day because they don't have access to money and therefore don't have access to food, or else don't have access to medical care, is, I don't know how many thousand, but quite likely to be hundreds of thousands. So this process of monetizing social relations is an extremely bloody struggle. That's what money means. It's a very, very bloody struggle every day to exclude people from the possibility of living. Not only the possibility of being involved in the absolute movement of becoming, but simply the possibility of living. And we know that it's a struggle, because of course people struggle against that. There are ways in which people try all the time to break the money chains, I suppose. I mean, either by the simplest is just by robbing, but they do, you know, also by setting up, by, I suppose, above all, by creating cooperative forms of support. You know, I mean, I think in Mexico, for example, if you don't have a job, you don't, it's not that you receive unemployment benefit. Basically, you depend on the cooperative support of your family. Yeah, and this is a way, it's kind of crucial to the way that people live. There is another example of, I suppose, the struggle in some sense against the commodity form, against the money form. So I suppose that's really, to come back, you mentioned open Marxism at the beginning. I think that's what I understand by open Marxism, is that the idea that we must open the categories and understand the struggles that are within them. So we must open money and see it as hiding an intense conflict. We must open value, we must open labor, we must open the commodity and see that there is this kind of seething world of struggle inside. Yeah? And before, in the morning before we came up, we mentioned, for example, the work of Postone, or Postone, and the German as well, Kurz and Japa. For me, their work is very important, but they don't do that. They don't open up these categories and look for the struggle that is inside them.
You were talking about obviously the kind of richness of capital, and to a certain extent, I think you're also talking about
richness of the book capital.
Yes, and also what's been kind of lost in translation as well. And I was looking at the translations, obviously Ben Fogg's Penguin, 1990, or the translations from 1985 and 1965. I was wondering if we kind of need a 21st century translation of capital, and what that would kind of look like, if you think it's something we need today.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, it's partly, yes, I mean, I think just replace wealth by richness, for example, would kind of make you think more, no? Because wealth is already kind of economicized, it's already a kind of fetishized concept, I suppose. Yeah, but it's not that the translators got it wrong. It's also the way that Marx expressed himself. And, so.
I know a guy, he's around 50 years old, and he believes he cannot believe in money. He believes money should be nationalized. And he has so much problem for that. And because of that, partly, he's been diagnosed as being schizophrenic. Because he doesn't understand money. He literally cannot understand the function of money. He's extremely smart guy, but just doesn't understand why money should stand between us and the thing we want.
Yes.
It's something from me. I mean, is there something wrong with him or something wrong with us that he developed understanding and we can't?
Yes, that's interesting. Shall I? Let me go on a little bit. The fifth, we're on to point 5, if you're. I suppose what we're trying to do, in a way, is we think of what we're trying to do partly as trying to develop an anti-identitarian reading of capital. What I mean by that, I suppose, really has to do with opening up the categories. If you think of what Marx says in the first sentence, that wealth exists in the form of the commodity, and then he goes on, therefore, we're going to start with the commodity, which seems like a closing of the category. Or it's really a sense of saying, well, as long as capitalism exists, there is an identity between wealth and the commodity. And the only way in which we can break that identity is by the revolution in the future, which will abolish capitalism completely. And I think partly because we now perceive that notion of revolution as having failed, we want to say, no, the antagonism between wealth and the commodity is not something that is enclosed until the revolution comes. But that antagonism exists all the time. It is an antagonism, as we've just been talking about. It's an antagonism that we experience all the time. Not only do we experience it, but we also make it the basis of our political action. So in that sense, we're saying this relationship between wealth and the commodity is not something that is closed with the origins of capitalism, but it's something that stays open. There's this open antagonism there all the time. In other words, there is not an identity between wealth and the commodity. Although it is true to say that wealth exists as the commodity, it is also true that wealth overflows the commodity, or that wealth exists in, against, and beyond the commodity form. Okay? In other words, yes, of course wealth exists in the commodity form. We go to the shop, we pay for things. But it also exists against the commodity form when we try and develop our capacities in different ways, for example. Or perhaps when we go to a shop and we see a book and we decide, no, we shouldn't pay for it, possibly. Or it exists also beyond the commodity form, in the sense of dreams and practices of developing richness outside the commodity form. In other words, there's a non-identitarian relation, which is not just non-identitarian, it is anti-identitarianism, because we're talking about an antagonism there. So really what we're trying to do, I suppose, or we're interested in doing, is developing then an anti-identitarian relation, an anti-identitarian reading of capital. No? And then if you're into Adorno, for example, then you think, well, of course, that is influenced by Adorno, who I suppose really developed the critique of capitalism as a critique of identity, and so understood identity as a constant process of closure of non-identity or of non-identitarian movements. In other words, classifications enclose us, definitions enclose us, identifications enclose us. But there is always this, and under the surface movement, I suppose, going against this enclosure, against this identification. No? Precisely here with political economy, it seems to me that Marx is saying, well, these categories are enclosing us. No? No. In that sense, what we are interested in is, I suppose, the other side of the categories. In other words, we are saying, when Marx says, well, the wealth or richness exists in the form of the commodity, and then he says, that's why we're going to start with the commodity. And most commentaries will then focus on the commodity. And what we want to say is, no, but you can't do that. Because in fact, the movement of wealth against the commodity is something that is there all the time. It doesn't just finish at the end of the first sentence. It is actually a constant movement, something that we feel in our experience, but is actually a constant movement through the 3 volumes of Capital. So wealth leads us on to use value, leads us on to concrete labor, leads us on to the richness or human forces of production, or what then becomes distorted as, forces of production. But it's kind of there as a constant, finally uncontainable force in Capital, in the book Capital. And the way that Marx talks about this has a lot to do with Postoni, it has a lot to do with the new reading, the so-called new reading of Capital. The way that Marx develops this is really through the concept of form. Okay? I mean, that's what he says. He says it in lots of different ways, but if you look at the first sentence, no? The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself, no? Or in the other translation, it appears as, and Capital is absolutely full of this. All the time he's saying something appears as, or presents itself as, or exists in the form of, or at first sight it is, but at first sight means that we have to look with the second sight. There's something beyond the first sight, which is the appearance. Okay. So Marx is really treating this issue of containment, I suppose, or overflowing, this issue of identification in terms of the category of form. For a long time, people didn't really bother with the idea of form when they were reading reading Capital. So for economists, for example, form just doesn't come into their reading of Capital, with very few exceptions. I mean, it's really with kind of very exceptional authors such as Rubin in the 1920s, Pashukanis in the 1920s as well, and of course Lukács at the same time, that the idea of form comes to be central. And in the case of Rubin and Pashukanis, they were executed because of that. I mean, literally, I mean, they were disappeared, they were executed by Stalin because they wanted to talk about the commodity as a specifically capitalist form of social relations, or the state, in Pashukanis' case, as a specifically capitalist form of social relations. And Stalin said, well, what's that? We are building up the workers' state. And bang. And, no. I mean, okay, so the question of form is very important. And form, the way I understand it, I think really means two things. One, it means that things exist in a historically specific form. So when he says that wealth exists in the form of the commodity, he's saying, well, in these societies, that is the case. So we have to think historically. In other words, he's talking about the historicity of categories, that all categories have their historical existence. But form also means form of appearance, but not just form of appearance. That when he says wealth exists in the form of the commodity, certainly it appears that way. We think of somebody rich as somebody who has a lot of commodities or a lot of money, rather than somebody who goes out and starts dancing across the hills, for example, and being happy and whatever. Okay, so we think of, it's true that wealth appears as commodity or money, no? But it's not just the appearance, it is also, as we know if we go into a shop and just try and take the clothes that we like. We know it's not just a question of appearance. It really is the case that we're not going to get access to that richness unless we have the money, unless we have our commodities to exchange, okay? And the question is then, how do you, okay, so this is something then that begins to appear with Lukács, Rubin, Pashukanis in the 1920s, and is really taken up again in the 1960s, 70s, like, well, people like Reichelt and Backhaus in Germany, and then has been taken up more recently by the so-called new reading of Marx by people like Kurz, Yappe, Postoni. No? Again, and the question there is, how do you understand form? Okay, you can say, well, okay, Marx is all about the volume form, the money form, the state form, whatever. We have to understand value as a form of social relations. We have to understand the state as a form of social relations. But there is still the question of whether that form simply encloses what is being expressed, or if there is an antagonism there. And I suppose our argument is no, that this is an antagonism. In other words, there is an antagonism between wealth or richness and the commodity form. Or in other words, that form has to be understood as a process of forming, and as a struggle to impose certain forms on social relations. And if it is a struggle to impose forms of social relations, then necessarily there is an anti-process, a contrary process of struggle. Okay? if we think of wealth, I mean, like we've been saying, yes, it exists in the form of the commodity, but the commodification of wealth is a constant and bloody struggle basically through money that costs the lives of thousands of people each day. But there is an anti-struggle. There are other ways of developing social relations, so that the form really has to be understood as a form process or as a process of forming. And this is really, I think for me, the breaking point with traditional Marxist politics. Because if you take the form as something that's closed, then you're saying, yes, we're entrapped in this tight logic. The only way is to kill the beast with one stroke. No? The hydra of capitalism, as the Zapatistas call it, with one stroke. No? If you say this is a process of forming, then you're saying, no, the struggle is there all the time and we are all involved in it. No? We struggle and have to struggle against this forming of social relations that is actually destroying the world. We struggle all the time against the monetization. I mean, we complain about it. Every time I come to Britain, every time I talk to colleagues in the universities, it is all about that dreadful monetization or commodification of the universities. But in a sense, yes, of course, and it's horrific. But we're all involved in a struggle against it as well. We're all involved in organizing events like this that say, no, we are walking in a different direction. No? In other words, the forming is a kind of an untruth, I suppose. It's the creation of an untruth, and we, in some sense, are always struggling against that. Or we have our favorite phrase, an expression of Richard Gunn, where if something exists in the form of something else, then it exists in the mode of being denied. Okay? That is its mode of existence. Social wealth is not wealth existing as a commodity. It's not just an appearance. It is its real mode of existence in this society. But it is a mode of existence that denies the wealth. Okay, so wealth exists, Marx could be saying in this first sentence, wealth exists in the form of the commodity. That is, it exists in the mode of being denied. And that necessarily means that it exists as struggle against its own negation. In other words, to say that something exists in the mode of being denied means also that there is a struggle against this denial. And this struggle against the denial, for me, finds a word in the great Zapatista word of dignity. Dignity is that. It's the struggle against the forming, the imposition of capitalist forms on social relations. Sorry, Mike.
Yes, no, John. Yeah, John. You said this afternoon, and you say very clearly in the paper, in your paper that you gave us to look at, that nobody presents the relation between wealth and commodity as one of active struggle. And I think that's your point against maybe Pistone and Kurtz. Pistone and Kurtz are writers in the tradition of the critique of value, which is really the form that John is talking about. Yeah. And You know, there is the book by Jeff Kay and James Marx,
Yes.
when they begin the book with the principle of abundance.
Okay.
And political order and the law of labour, I think, written in the 1980s. And that's precisely their point about abundance. And what's more, they make a connection between capitalist wealth and abundant wealth, a new form of social value for humanity and nature. So there is a connection. It's not just another form, but abundance itself is created in the moment of capital. So it's not as if we have to look. It's not as if we have to look for it elsewhere. It comes out of the process.
Right. I must go back to that.
I think Postone and Kurtz are trying to develop a critical approach, rather like you were talking about translation for the 21st century, in the sense that I think there really is a critique of form. Postone talks about not a critical theory from the position of labour, but a critique of labour in capitalism. So that's absolutely. But more than that, I think a critique of the concept of subjectivity.
Okay.
So rather than locating subjectivity in humanness, for example, Postone talks about a social theory of subjectivity that is itself historical.
Okay.
So not relying on a trans-historical category of any kind.
Yeah.
And one finds it in people like Jacques Rancière, the concept of subjectification, the part of the no part, which is a subject that is not even in existence. Whereas one might interpret from what you're saying that the subject is already ready-made.
Yeah, no, I don't want to say that. On the first point, yes, I mean, Postone and Kurtz obviously have they have the critique of form, the critique of labour. Postone's book is terrific. I mean, really, my objection is that the critique of labour is not seen as active struggle. He just doesn't make that link. No? I mean, he doesn't think, well, of course we have to criticize labour, but not only do we have to criticize labour theoretically, we have to understand that our lives are actually based on the critique of labour. You know? And the way we organize and what we think we are doing today is an active critique of labour. You know? That's what doesn't come into Postone, I think. There is no, in that sense, there is no concept of the categories as active struggle. No? And Werner wrote a review of the book, I think, which basically says that's why he ends up being a functionalist. I mean, I think that's, no, but that's kind of a. And on the second point, I think you're completely right, and I think, in that sense, the presentation has been misleading. But I suppose it was a point I wanted to get to later on, perhaps now that you've mentioned it. Is it's not my idea isn't one of transhistorical richness or transhistorical anything. In fact, when Marx says richness exists in the form of the commodity. And the Grundrisse quote says, well, what would it be if we forget about the form of the commodity? But that's a transhistorical statement, I suppose. But no, I want to say it exists as struggle against the form of the commodity, and this struggle develops historically all the time. So when we here say, you know, richness is the absolute movement of becoming, for example, we are actually saying it in a specific context, you know, and we are thinking perhaps of what is happening in the universities. Are we thinking of our lives? Or we are thinking of whatever retirement means to us, whatever, no? And we're saying, yes, we we are kind of recapturing this idea that seems ahistorical and utopian, the absolute movement of our becoming. We are recapturing it, or we are taking it up in a specific context, which means that it only exists negatively. So I don't want to positivize richness, and I don't want to ahistoricize richness. I want to say, but there is this ecstatic relation, if you like, standing outside relation between richness and the commodity. The richness is there all the time, but it's there all the time as resistance against the process of commodification. Yeah.
Could I suggest maybe we have a cup of tea?
Yes, you could.
I'm sorry, did you want to say something?
Yes, Marcel wants
Marcel
to.
had a question and then maybe have a break?
Can I have the question after the break?
Whatever you prefer.
Now, or whatever.
Whatever you prefer.
Well, it's not really the question. So the one thing I was, I always felt that Werner was not quite on the money concerning post-tone, especially the use of the idea of structuralism seems to me a bit not quite right there, because emphasis on structure doesn't mean structuralism. So I think structuralism is quite a different kind of animal. Whereas obviously in Post-Tone's book there is a heavy emphasis on the structure, but that is also in your book the case. No? So that there is, I mean, the thing against which we struggle is, you can call that a structure if you like. No? That is or form is probably the more elegant word for that. So that doesn't make it structuralist, simply to acknowledge that there is something very heavy against which the struggle is directed, and to acknowledge the enormity of that is not structuralism. So that is simply an acknowledgement of how difficult the task is. And when you say that we struggle all the time against the commodification, so that
What are you doing here?
what I'm doing.
You didn't come here to improve your curriculum vitae and get yourself another job. You didn't.
Certainly pick up some useful bits from teaching. So that is exactly the question. So I am probably. So it is at least a rather mixed picture.
Of course it's mixed and it's contradictory. I think for me the difference between structuralism and not structuralism is that when they, let's say, talk about the structures, they don't present those structures as being struggle. You know, so they talk, say, you know, money is there, the state, whatever. There is this, yes, the structuralists, you know. And we would say, no, you have to understand these as certainly the structures exist. Of course money exists. Of course the state exists. Of course, you know, social relations really exist in these forms. But we have to understand that those forms as forms of struggle, you know, forms of aggression. Money is an aggression against us. Capital is an aggression against us that is constantly met by an anti-struggle. And we have, that is important because the only way that we can think of revolution is starting from those, on the basis of those anti-struggles, if you like. Whereas a structuralism really presents a closed world of structures, which leads you, it seems to me, either to depression and no way out, which may be true, or to the notion of the only way out is through the intervention of some force from outside the party. No, and that's why.
One of Post-Tone's main points, I would think, but that is just in breaks. The other thing I wanted to say was, if just on the first sentence, so I also find, so in addition to what you're saying, this sentence, like many others in Capital, is also beyond the mentioning of the wealth or richness, is also in other respects incredibly beautiful and elegant. For example, in the way it avoids very deliberately the word capitalism. So there's a structuralism, if you want to. So everybody in our so-called left and everywhere, constantly everybody talks about capitalism, which is a word that I think Marx probably never used.
I think that's right.
It's from Sombart or from other right-wing sociologists, basically. That doesn't happen in Marx. And he doesn't even say capitalist society, so he says, even much so he bypasses even that. So he says, a society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails. So even more specific than saying capitalist society, which even that would be too kind of static and too
heavy,
too sort of clumsy. And then in this one case, the English actually is better than the German because it says prevails, which is herrscht. So herrscht is obviously governs or rules or dominates. So probably dominates. So it's not quite clear. The prevails is actually quite nice because it allows to think that there are other things as well.
Yes, that's right.
If you think of, I don't know, I'm thinking of Wallerstein, but also other people would acknowledge that there are in capitalist societies other things operating at the same time with the capitalist mode of production that are sort of integrated in it and serve the capitalist mode of production, but they are not the capitalist mode of production. Stuff like that, so you can think there. So in that sense, it is incredibly elegant. And also one thing with the translation that happens a lot in English people love putting the definite article everywhere. Just everywhere. So they just throw definite articles in all sentences when they're not necessarily there in the German. So here, for example, it says, in welchen kapitalistische Produktionsweise herrscht. So there's no article there. So it doesn't say in welchen die kapitalistische Produktionsweise herrscht. And so that gives the German formulation also even more bit of subtlety because it's not definite. So capitalist, so you should actually translate without the. So it's obviously not a huge difference, but it gives it a little bit more elasticity, as if it wasn't such a clearly fixed thing. So it is capitalist mode of production roots. So, but it is actually quite indefinite. In a certain sense. So it gives it some of the openness that you mentioned, which is also lost in translation.
Do you know that Reichtum in German is the same word, wealth and richness.
Yes,
and
like riqueza.
Too.
Yes, exactly.
So there might be, something that made the translation be wealth instead of richness.
Yes, I don't know.
Because it's an economic term. Wealth is more about having things, where richness would be applied to. So the translation is actually pro-capitalist, pro-economicist.
But you can say a wealth of feelings or wealth.
You can, but it doesn't resonate quite the same as richness. Richness of experience, you would say. You could say wealth of experience, but they're not identical. I think, I don't know, it seems to me they're not quite. One point on what the Postone point, and whether I'm being fair. I think I am being fair to him, but that there is a difference there. For us, it's a very important discussion. For us, the discussion with Postone, the discussion with Yappe. We haven't got on to courts yet, but. Yeah. Right. What I would like to do even if it means rushing a little bit, shouldn't it? I'd like to cover 7, 8, 9, 10, I suppose, and then leave the others. The 7, I mean, in a way, I suppose one implication of what we're doing is to, which is also true of the value form analysis, is to say we shift attention to the opening chapters. I suppose in the very traditional reading of Capital, really the focus was on exploitation, which comes in, was in chapter 6, as the you know, and to some extent the opening chapters were read as a warmer upper. No, kind of this gets you going, and then you hit the real thing with the conflict between labor and capital. And I think what we're saying is no, it's actually, it's really you have to take it from the opening chapters, not just from the first sentence, of course. But in the opening chapters, we get a conflict presented that is even more fundamental than the conflict between labor and capital. Okay? In other words, what we get presented in the first chapter, I mean, we've got, okay, wealth exists in the commodity form. We then go on to use value exists in the form of value. Now, use value really being utility of things, useful things, things understood or products understood in terms of usefulness, which is really wealth, or one way of seeing wealth, exists in the form of value. And then he says, well, of course, this means that labor, too, exists in two aspects, two dimensions. What he calls concrete or useful labor, which produces use values, and abstract labor, which produces value. And he says this double character of labor is the pivot on which the whole understanding of political economy turns. Or which means really it is the pivot on which an understanding of capitalism, or of the society in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, turns. So he's introducing us to a conflict there, right at the beginning. Concrete or useful labor, it's not a very good term because I prefer to talk about useful or concrete doing or activity, produces richness, produces events like this, produces meals for your friends. No. Okay, so we've got that on the one hand, but in capitalism, this useful doing, this concrete labor, as he calls it, is subordinated to abstract labor, or it undergoes a process of abstraction. It undergoes really a process by which it is gradually pulled in to the logic of the system. And in that process, it is abstracted from all meaning. Okay? It loses all meaning, except its only meaning is to contribute to the reproduction of a system without any meaning other than the expansion of value, other than the expansion of profit. Okay, so you like making tables, for example. This is something that's useful as a concrete labor. Afterwards, you like to use them to put your food on, or to put your laptop on, or whatever. Or if you've already got enough tables, you give them to your friends. That is concrete labor, or concrete doing. No. This, the problem is, of course, you want to do this all the time. The problem is somehow you have to live. In other words, you begin to think, well, in order to get food, I'm going to have to sell my tables. All right? And I begin to sell my tables at first, perhaps to friends, gradually to an anonymous market. I set up a shop, going to sell my tables. I discover after a few weeks that I'm not getting much money, that I really need more money to live on. So I think, well, I have to produce faster. I have to change my labor process. I have to make it faster. I have to produce them faster so that I can produce enough tables in order to have access to the richness of the world. Okay? Gradually, the process of producing the tables gets turned into something else. It gets turned into a means of earning money. I no longer really enjoy it. Its significance is no longer that it gives me pleasure to make tables, or I feel proud of my skills. Now it's a way of making money. If after a couple of years I realize that no, it's not giving me enough money, then okay, I'll try and think of another way of making money. So I don't know, I decide to sell lottery tickets instead, or whatever you like. In other words, the activity becomes the only significance that it has is to make money in order to live. In other words, it loses its significance. So you can think of this abstraction as a process of being pulled or dragged in to the logic of the system. And you're dragged into the logic of the system in a way that the activity itself really is no longer very important to you, or really doesn't give you pleasure. So that the only meaning of the activity is that it gives me money, which means, thought of socially, that it leads to the expansion of commodity wealth, or of value in this society. Yesterday, again, the traditional conversation with other university people, when I come, they say, what they're saying all the time is that, we started off as lecturers because it made sense to us. And more it's being deprived of its sense, It's becoming just something we do to make money. Now, we would like to get out and to retire. Literally, what I was told last night. And, in other words, this process of abstraction is something that's kind of active all the time. It's really the other side of the process of commodification of wealth, is that our very activity is abstracted. It's drawn into a totality. This abstraction, if you like, is a process of totalization of human activity into a totality which has no sense at all other than to expand value. If we think of it like that, then we see that prior to the conflict between labor and capital, there is another conflict, which is the conflict that we all feel between our concrete potentially self-determined activity, making tables because we like it, on the one hand, and what we actually have to go out and do each day. You know, get up in the morning at 7 o'clock and organize ourselves so that we go out and we do it in order to make a living. So there is that conflict between doing and abstract labor, which is there all the time, you know, which can also be seen as a process, a conflict between, I suppose, really a centrifugal force of saying, I or we collectively want to determine our activity. That's what autonomy is about, for example, no? Or the kind of autonomous movements. No? It's a movement of detotalization, you know, of saying, well, no, we want to shape our own activity. On the other hand, there's this enormous centripetal force which hauls us in to a logic where we don't control anything. We simply have to go the way that money tells us, basically. So, in a way, what I suppose part of this reading is to say, look, whereas the traditional readings simply assume the complete domination of concrete labor by abstract labor, so that our activity is just commodified and that's it. In fact, we don't feel it like that. We all actually struggle against the abstraction of our activity. That's what we do every single day, that we want to try and shape our lives in a way that has meaning for us. You know, for people who study sociology or philosophy or critical pedagogy, then, you know, what on earth are you doing? This necessarily means, at some level, a decision to walk in the wrong direction, a decision to go and do what you want to do because it interests you, because you think it's useful, because you think maybe it can contribute to a different society that isn't just dominated by money. And then, of course, when you finish your sociology degree or philosophy degree, very often you just have to face the real world and you're dragged back in to this process of totalization that you've been trying to avoid. But I think that what I feel is that there is a movement in the concept of revolution, and there is a movement in anti-capitalist struggle or class struggle away from the idea of revolution as conquering state power, no, which was really the idea of conquering the totality and then transforming the totality. And what you get now with the whole rise over the last 20 years or so of autonomous politics in one form or another is really the idea of revolution not as conquering power, but as a process of detotalization, as a process of trying to unhinge ourselves from the totalizing logic of capital and to create something else. No? And this can involve, obviously, setting up autonomous groups outside state or capital in any sense. It also is a process, I think, of trying to create things within universities. So in terms of what you were chatting to me about earlier, Mike, it's both, if we think of it in terms of education, it's both the process of setting up or creating alternative education outside the institutions, but it is also doing what we are trying to do here today, what you are trying to do here in Lincoln what we are trying to do in Puebla, and saying, okay, we're inside the state system. We know that there's this tremendous totalizing force that is tendentially subordinating us to the commodification of education, but within that we will walk in the opposite direction. We will do different things. No? And it's a contradictory process. But so what you find, I mean, and what this idea means, I think, is if you think of abstract labor as labor, if you think of concrete labor, this making the table because we like to make the table, giving talks like this because we like to give talks like this. If you think of that as doing rather than labor, then what we are saying is that the revolution is the movement not of labor against capital, but it is the movement against labor and capital. It is against this horrible perversion of our life's activity into the process of making money. No? So the struggle has to be understood as a struggle against labor and therefore against capital. And I think that is actually what has been happening over the last 15, 20 years. Is more and more anti-capitalist groups are saying, we are against labor. We are not labor against capital. We are against capital and therefore labor, or we are against labor and therefore capital. We want to do something else with our lives. Which means that, and this is point 8, that we begin to think of capitalism, I think, not in the first place as a system of exploitation, but we think of it in the first place as a system of frustration. Okay? Capital is the systematic frustration of our capability of determining what we want to do with our lives. This is not, as we'll see in a moment, it's not to deny the importance of exploitation. It's just to say in the center is this, first of all, is this systematic process of frustration, of subordinating our life activity to the logic of capital. This may happen within the factory. It may happen within the office. It may happen within the university. It may happen to students. It may happen, or it does rather happen, at every level of life, of living activity or of social activity. No, it also happens, yes, just, I don't know, wherever you like. This need to get access to the riches of the world by allowing ourselves to be drawn into a logic that we know is absolutely destructive and senseless. That is something that shapes all our lives at every point. No? Shapes, of course, relations between parents and children, to come back to that. There is no parent who does not worry, I think. You know, of course, we want to show compassion, love, encourage autonomy and everything, but at some point, I think every parent begins to worry about, but will our children find employment? You know, will they live in misery or will they actually find some employment? You know, we are all into that. We're all so that this antagonism between doing, on the one hand, or push toward doing, I think, includes a push towards self-determination, no, and richness, antagonism between doing and this abstraction into meaningless activity is there all the time. It actually infects every level of social activity. So that's why I want to say, if we start from richness, if we start from this wow, absolute movement to becoming, really we're starting from frustration. We're saying this, when Marx says, well, richness is this absolute movement to becoming, it's just that unfortunately in capitalism it exists in the commodity form. And that is frustration. No. That is, so we start from thinking of the struggle, I suppose, from our potential, from our frustration, which we all feel. And the other thing about frustration is you cannot talk about frustration without talking about antagonism. No, I mean, frustration means, no, I mean, it's something we want to, we're bursting against. It's something that we feel is there in our lives as an antagonism. It's different from domination in that sense. If you think of ourselves as being dominated, no, but if you think of us as being frustrated, you're saying, there's this live antagonism in all of us. No, and that seems to be that what Marx is saying in those first chapters. Capital is built upon the frustration of our potential, of our richness, of what we could do. Which is not to me say that exploitation is not important. Because in a way we can see exploitation as an intensification of frustration. Exploitation is when you have to go into the factory or you work to produce profits for the capitalist. Obviously, that intensifies the frustration, because then not only are you forced to think about how will I sell my products, you're forced to think, oh, I have to obey the orders of my supervisor, and so much of my boss. No, I have to work in a way that contributes to the profits, in the end of the day, of capital. Okay. So exploitation is an intensification of frustration. But if we shift all the balance to exploitation, which is what has happened traditionally, then I think unwittingly we are narrowing down the process. We're saying that here, the center, that we are introducing a hierarchy into the frustration. We're saying that the real struggle is the struggle of the traditional working class against exploitation by capital. And there the question of the revolt against labor gets lost. Whereas if we say no, the real center is frustration, then we're actually understanding, I think, the capital relation is something much broader, something that penetrates into all our lives, and we're understanding our own struggles, daily struggles against frustration as part of the struggle against capital. And the last point, okay, which is in a way I feel, I suppose one of the things I've been feeling in writing these theses is that at the end of the day I should go up and nail them to the door of the cathedral up there. I mean, that they're kind of deliberately heretical in a sense, but I think that we have to be heretical. The most heretical one is actually point 8. No, it's not point 8. It's point 10, which is the last one I'm going to talk about. If we talk about the dual character of labour, then it seems to me we have to talk about the dual character of the working class in its broadest sense. No? I mean, on the one hand, we're talking about the richness, the potential, the absolute movement of becoming. It's what we can do and what we do, and it's the creation of lovely tables or beautiful dinners for our friends or talks or whatever. This is a process of doing, you know. We all do it. In that sense, we are all doers. But there is another way, obviously. If we think from abstract labor, then obviously this leads on to exploitation. It leads on to the process of employment. It leads on to a process of classification, or classification of identification of people, however we want to do it, as members of the working class. And then you begin to think, okay, but do we then think of the working class as being the revolutionary subject? Or do we think that really we have to think of revolution or social transformation as being a movement against this classification? No. Do we have to think we had the fantastic, beautiful thesis completed about a year ago by Katerina Nasioka, analyzing the uprisings in Greece and in Oaxaca a few years ago in terms of the movement of the proletariat against the working class. Her argument is that no, what's happening actually, it's not that these are not working class movements. It's not that they're movements outside the working class either. These are people rising up and breaking the rules, breaking the classifications imposed by capital. And then you say, well, okay, but Marx always thought of revolution as being working class revolution. And I think this year, for the first time, after I don't know how many classes on Marx and capital, you actually see that it's just not clear at all. Marx talks about the formation of the working class. I mean, really first in chapter 10 on the struggle for the working day. And then he talks, of course, then later on with the struggles around the introduction of new technology and the transformation of the labor process. And then later on in the process of primitive accumulation and the formation of the working class. And the strange thing is that he talks about the working class as representatives of the commodity labor power. And he talks about the working class as becoming an accessory of capital. And then you begin to wonder, and I'm still wondering what Marx was thinking, but is he saying that, look, this process of the formation of capital is the formation of a class of workers who are actually integrated into capital, who are transformed so that they become an accessory of capital, with the implication that we have to think, if we want to think, that we have to think of revolution in terms of, in some sense, yes, the proletariat against the working class in this sense. If we think of the working class as being based upon abstract labor, then we have to think of the proletariat really as the mobilization of of frustration, not frustration outside the working class. Of course, frustration will be at its deepest in the factory, where you just have to turn the same screw over and over again. That's where the real frustration will be. But, well, not just where there's lots of frustration everywhere. But then, you know, is there something else happening here? Is Marx himself guiding us towards an idea of the struggle of the subject with no name, which we can perhaps call proletariat, against the working class? Yeah. So that's really where we are. I don't want to go on to 11, 12, the others. I mean, that's enough. Yeah.
Questions or comments? You know, John, Robert Kurtz talks about, in responding to your problematic of two kinds of labour, the working class and labour as an abstraction. He talks about esoteric and exoteric labour.
No.
So, exoteric is labour as concrete labour, the working class at work. But esoteric work is not simply abstract labour, but labour itself is already an abstraction.
Yeah.
And in that sense, Marx, either consciously or who knows, but he is writing about, and that's the way Robert Kurtz tries to formulate the problematic that you identify.
Robert who?
Kurtz, from the Critique of Value.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah.
So that's the way they form. It's not only him, but that's the way they formulate it. And Jappe as well. Labour is already an abstraction. It's that getting beyond the working class, but it's also exoteric, the working class in the factory. And that represents the labour form, the commodity form of labour power. So that might be, I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yes.
But perhaps there is also an overlapping of his political activity with the workers in a particular way, that, it's not, it's not the analysis, Marx.
Okay.
That identifies, and then of course the political action of Marxists or revolutionaries, Russian Revolution, etc. Following up from there, if it's not clear, if capital gives room for other interpretations, other forms of existence of the subjects of doing or work, but definitely politically he was involved with the working class.
Of course, yes.
So I think.
Yes, I mean, I think thinking about these issues, it's partly wanting to say, look, Marx was saying something else. I think in the first sentence, it seems to me there is no doubt. I mean, Marx was, with the contrast between wealth and the commodity, it seems to me that this, for Marx, certainly, was going beyond the commodity, was going against what he himself said. On other points, I suppose there's the feeling, well, maybe we have to help Marx along a little bit, Or there are ambiguities, of course, perhaps contradictions.
Just a thought question. I just wondered if you sort of talking about richness and wealth and looking at it through that lens, if we were to celebrate or put the lens on acts of doing, acts of community doing, rather than constantly re-examine the other stuff, do you think that would make them more real and therefore more it's kind of culturally understood? So rather than the emphasis constantly being on labour, we focus elsewhere.
I think yes, to some extent. And I think there's a move now, certainly in Latin America, but I think here as well, to say, no, we can firstly, we must not start from domination. We have to really think from struggle. And we have to think of a movement from below, you know, both to understand what's happening and, yes, to give more visibility and importance to these movements from below. I think there's a slight problem with this, or sometimes, is that if we just focus on the movement from below, then we actually lose sight of the antagonism that is central to the existence of us all. No? But yeah, no, but I think that's right. No? Sorry, Marcel.
I might be wrong, but I think we are kind of asking a question that didn't really exist for Marx in that way, because on the subject, I mean, there's one place in Grundrisse where he actually says that capital is the subject, but there's nowhere, as far as I recall, anything even hinting that the working class is the subject. So that is, I think that comes from Lukács, and Lukács obviously has this from the entirely non-Marxist philosophical background that he was coming from.
Did I say the working class was the subject?
No,
I don't know. Maybe I did.
Maybe
or the subject of revolution, perhaps. Yeah. But not the subject of capitalism. No.
But just any subject. So isn't the class a subject of whatever? So I don't think that occurs. That would have occurred to Marx. That is something philosophical from outside Marx that basically comes in with Leninism and all kinds of other things. Whereas he does on one occasion say that capital is the subject. So that's it's quite structuralist if you like, but it's a completely different kind of question. Whereas when he exactly this thing. Whereas when he talks about classes, he's sometimes very precise, sort of in an almost sociological sense, like in the 18th Brumaire or something, where it just looks at all kinds of different groups or groupings. Or
do you mean capital in general? In all his work, or in capital?
In general, in
general. Well, not in the Communist Manifesto. I know it's a political piece of work, but the idea that the working class will break with itself and free everybody else with it. Where is it coming from? It's not.
That's true. Yeah, that
it's
is
something that So because it is the embodiment of the contradiction that John is explaining. When that, of course, with the consciousness of it, when that happens, there will be no way to stop it. When everybody feels the frustration and goes ahead, it is the worker, not capital, that depends on. But not. There's no chapter about the subject of revolution. I think it became more political later on.
But obviously, in reality, these guys actually were artisans, so they weren't factory workers, because there weren't that many factories. Certainly in Germany. And when they were factory workers, they were actually quite disciplined. So they were actually quite pro-capitalist, probably.
Yeah, the question I don't think was theoretical. The question was political.
No, the question is political. The question is, but also for us. I mean, the question is really what happened. You know, what happened to these working class revolutions? How did they become such disasters? How do we understand that? And I don't think it can just be put onto Stalin, and it can't just be put onto Lenin or the Bolsheviks either. I think we have to say the Marxist, the whole movement, really from the beginning, perhaps, operated with a unitary concept of labor. They, although Marx said, look, this double character of labor is the pivot of everything. Nobody actually took that seriously or bothered to mention it, practically. No? And then what you get is the labor movement built up upon abstract labor, upon wage labor, And Marx is saying all the time, no, wage labor is an abomination. No, if we want to talk about, well, he doesn't say that, but I help him. He says if we want to talk about revolution, obviously it's the revolution against wage labour. Actually, it does say it more or less. No?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
It's 4 o'clock, so our session, our formal session has come to an end.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank John very, very much for...
No,